All right, let's dive into Mannerism.
Yeah.
Renaissance art. Well, this is like Renaissance art, but with a twist, more dramatic. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You were saying how you really wanted to understand Mannerism and get those aha moments, and I think we've got some pretty interesting stuff for you today.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Think like elongated figures and compositions that are kind of off kilter and a lot more tension, almost like you can feel it coming off the canvas.
Yeah, and it really captures that feeling of the 16th century. It was a time when everything was changing, the art, the world. It was a period of religious upheaval and political intrigue and even new scientific discoveries that were totally changing people's beliefs.
Sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get to all those juicy historical details, let's just start with the basics.
Yeah.
What is Mannerism?
So basically, Mannerism emerged in 16th century Italy, and it was kind of like a response to the High Renaissance. You know how the High Renaissance was all about achieving this perfect harmony and balance in art?
Right. Perfect.
Well, the Mannerists, they decided to shake things up a bit. They moved away from those classical ideals and embraced a more complex, more artificial, and more expressive style.
So if the High Renaissance was like a perfectly composed photograph,
Right.
Mannerism is more like a candid shot.
Yeah, exactly. And some of the biggest names in art were leading this artistic revolution, like Michelangelo, the one who did the Sistine Chapel.
Oh, yeah.
Even he was pushing boundaries, experimenting with forms, and really challenging what art could be. You also have other pioneers like Pontormo Parmigianino and Bronzino. These artists really broke the mold.
It's pretty gutsy to question perfection, which is what the High Renaissance was all about.
Yeah.
But how did this rebellion actually show up in the art? What are the things you would notice right away if you were looking at a Mannerist painting?
One of the first things you'd notice is how they use elongated figures. Proportions are stretched and distorted. It creates this almost surreal effect. And it's not just about being visually different. This distortion is really tied to the anxieties and uncertainties of the time.
Yeah, it's like they're stretching reality itself, like those figures are trying to break free from the canvas.
That's a great way to put it. And it actually connects to another characteristic of Mannerism complex compositions. The High Renaissance loved balanced symmetrical arrangements, but Mannerist artists said, nope. They created these dynamic and often asymmetrical compositions that were packed with figures and movement.
Almost like they're visually representing the chaos of the world around them.
Exactly. If the High Renaissance was a calm landscape, then Mannerism is a raging storm.
I like that. And in the middle of that storm, you've got those Mannerist figures twisting and turning as if caught in some invisible current. There's also this other layer to Mannerism that I find fascinating, the drama and tension.
Oh, absolutely. Mannerist artists were masters at creating a specific mood and atmosphere of uneasiness or anxiety. They did this through their use of light, color, and pose. When you look at a Mannerist painting, you can almost feel the emotion coming from it. They wanted you to experience the complexities of the era, that feeling of uncertainty that was everywhere.
So it's not just about what you see, but also what you feel.
Right. Think of it as a visual representation of the world holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. To really understand this fascination with the unsettling, the dramatic, the complex, we need to look at the world these artists lived in.
Let's do it. We've got the Reformation political turmoil, the rise of science. It's a lot to cover. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with the Reformation. This was a period of huge religious change. The Catholic Church was facing challenges to its authority, and new Protestant groups were popping up. This turmoil had a huge impact on art. Mannerism became a way to express the complexities of faith and doubt during this time.
It's fascinating how art can be a window into the soul of an era, capturing those big changes in beliefs. But the Reformation wasn't the only thing shaking things up in the 16th century. You had a lot of political instability too, right?
Yeah. Definitely, Europe was like a hotbed of conflict and intrigue. There were wars, power struggles, even the sack of Rome in 1527, which was a huge shock to everyone. These events added to the anxiety and uncertainty, which we see reflected in Mannerist art.
Like a historical snapshot, frozen in time, capturing those anxieties.
Yeah.
But there's also the rise of science. How did those big scientific discoveries influence Mannerism?
This was a time when new scientific discoveries were challenging old views. People were starting to question everything, and that questioning spirit is totally there in Mannerism and how it rejects artistic norms.
So these artists are not only challenging the rules of art, but they're also reflecting a world that's challenging the rules of everything.
Exactly. And that questioning spirit, that willingness to push against the status quo would have a huge impact not just on Mannerism, but on art movements that came after.
So we've got this incredible artistic movement born out of a world in transition. It breaks rules, questions norms, expresses the anxieties of the generation. What's not to love?
Well, Mannerism isn't just about breaking the mold. It also acts as a bridge between the Renaissance and the Baroque periods. It's this fascinating transition that sets the stage for even more dramatic artistic expressions.
So it's like a stepping stone, taking those Renaissance ideas and adding this new energy and emotional intensity.
Exactly. It's all connected. It's a link in the chain of art history, and you can see its influence in the drama of the Baroque period and beyond.
This is incredible. We've covered so much, but I feel like we're just getting started. To recap, Mannerism pops up in 16th century. Italy throws out the high Renaissance rulebook, embraces elongated figures, mind-bending compositions, and all that drama, all while reflecting a world that's going through some serious changes. And it's just the beginning of even more incredible art movements.
We've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover.
I can't wait. But I guess we need to take a short break and come back to explore some of the philosophical ideas behind Mannerism. It's about to get really interesting.
Definitely.
Stay with us.
Welcome back. We were just talking about how Mannerism acts like a bridge between the Renaissance and Baroque periods. But it's more than just like a visual shift, right?
Yeah, there's this whole other philosophical side to Mannerism that I find really interesting. It's not just about looks, but about like what was going on in people's minds.
Right. Mannerism reflects this big change in how people saw the world. It's a shift away from that medieval idea of order and certainty towards something way more complex and uncertain.
So the High Renaissance was about finding perfection and order in art. Mannerism was about embracing the beauty of imperfection and a world that doesn't always make sense.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Mannerism challenged the idea of artistic rules and said, hey, what about ambiguity and complexity? They brought this intellectual playfulness to their art.
It's like they're saying, let's not just follow the rules, let's play with them and see what happens.
Exactly. Think of it like this. If the High Renaissance was a perfectly composed symphony, then Mannerism is like a jazz improvisation. It takes those classical elements and like twists them into something unexpected and exciting.
I love that analogy. It really captures that sense of spontaneity and experimentation in Mannerist art.
Yeah.
It's like they're pushing the boundaries of what's possible both visually and intellectually.
And this ties into the idea of maniera, which is where the term mannerism comes from. Maniera in Italian means a kind of stylishness and artistic flair that goes beyond just copying nature.
So it's not just about being technically skilled, but adding your own personal touch, your interpretation.
Exactly. Mannerist artists were all about showing off their skill, their ability to manipulate forms and compositions in surprising ways. They weren't afraid to break the rules to create something artificial and stylized.
I bet that annoyed some people back then. It's like, why mess with a good thing?
Oh, absolutely. Mannerism had its critics who thought it was all style and no substance, too artificial and clever. But that's what makes it so cool. It was art meant to make you think, to question what you thought was beautiful and meaningful.
Like they're inviting us to look beyond the surface and really engage with the art on a deeper level. And this connects to the whole intellectual scene of the 16th century, right? This was a time of massive change and upheaval, not just in religion and politics, but in how people thought about themselves and the world.
Absolutely. The rise of humanism during the Renaissance put this new focus on human potential and individual achievement. This focus on the individual and personal experience that's reflected in Mannerism's focus on personal expression and artistic experimentation.
So Mannerism wasn't just a break from the art of the past. It reflected a whole new way of seeing the world and humanity's place in it. It's like seeing humanity step out from the shadows of the medieval world and into a new era.
I like that. And this connection between artistic expression and the bigger cultural, intellectual shifts of the time, that's what makes Mannerism so fascinating. It's a window into a world in transition, a world trying to understand new ideas, new discoveries, and what it meant to be human.
And we can still connect with those ideas and emotions centuries later just by looking at a painting. Talk about time travel.
It really is amazing. But speaking of connections, you mentioned Mannerism as this bridge between the Renaissance and the Baroque. It seems like such a unique style, almost like a detour on the art history highway.
Yeah, it might seem like a detour, but I think it was important. Mannerism took those Renaissance ideas of humanism in classical forms and made them more dramatic, more emotional, more dynamic. These elements became super important in the Baroque style that came after.
So you're saying Mannerism was a necessary step in the evolution of art, a time of experimentation that led to the energy and drama of the Baroque?
Exactly. It's like Mannerism loosened things up, allowed artists to express themselves in new ways, and those explorations eventually led to the incredible art of the Baroque period.
I'm starting to see why Mannerism, despite its critics, is now seen as so important in Western art history. It's like that awkward teenage phase that we all go through, but it's actually essential for growth and development.
So true. But seriously, It's amazing how much we've learned about mannerism in this deep dive, and we haven't even talked about specific masterpieces yet.
We've only just scratched the surface. But now that we understand the historical context and the philosophical ideas behind mannerism, I think we're ready to dive into some examples of how it all comes together in actual works of art.
Let's see those masterpieces.
All right, let's start with one of the most iconic and maybe strangest examples of mannerism, Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck.
Oh, yeah. The one where Mary's neck looks like it could reach the top shelf without a stepladder?
That's the one. It perfectly shows how mannerists used those elongated figures and distorted proportions to create that unsettling yet captivating look.
I think it's time to move from the why to the wow, don't you?
Let's get into the details.
Okay, hit me with those must-see mannerist works, the ones that really show everything we've been talking about.
Okay, well, we can't talk about mannerism without mentioning Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck again.
Oh, right. That's the one with the super long figures, right?
Exactly. It perfectly shows how mannerists played with proportions to create that unsettling but captivating look. Mary's neck is unbelievably long, and baby Jesus looks almost too big for his body.
It's definitely a painting that makes you stop and stare.
It challenges our expectations of what a religious painting should look like.
Speaking of challenging expectations, what about Pontormo?
His Deposition from the Cross is another iconic mannerist work. The figures are all twisted and contorted, almost like acrobats. It's a chaotic, emotionally charged scene that totally breaks from those traditional, calm depictions of the Deposition.
It's like he's capturing that raw grief and turmoil.
Exactly. And then there's Bronzino. He's known for his elegant but strangely cold and distant portraits.
Oh, yeah. They're like mannequins, perfectly posed, but without any warmth or emotion.
Exactly. That detachment, that artificiality, that's another key element of mannerism. It reflects the complex intellectual and emotional world of that time.
Okay, so we've got elongated necks, swirling figures, and emotionally distant portraits. What else should we be looking for when we see mannerist art?
Look at their use of color. Mannerists often used unusual, even jarring color combinations.
Like they weren't afraid to break the rules of color theory.
Nope. Think like acidic greens, shocking pinks, deep blues. They used color to set the mood, to heighten the drama, to make the viewer a little uncomfortable.
It's like they're using color as another way to mess with our perceptions.
Exactly. And don't forget about light. Mannerists loved dramatic contrast of light and shadow to create a sense of theatricality and mystery.
All about that drama and tension we keep talking about.
Right. So when you see a mannerist work, take your time and really look at the details.
The colors, the light, the composition, those exaggerated figures.
Think about how those elements work together to create that classic mannerist look, both beautiful and unsettling, intellectual and emotional.
It's amazing how much depth and complexity there is to mannerism.
And you're getting those aha moments you wanted.
Oh, for sure. But the biggest aha moment for me is this. If mannerism was a response to a world that was changing like crazy, what does today's art say about our world?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's something to think about as you keep exploring the world of art.
So much to think about. If you want to check out more mannerist art, I definitely recommend looking up the artists we've talked about, Parmigianino, Pontormo, Bronzino.
And don't forget El Greco. His later work is considered mannerist too, with those crazy elongated figures and dramatic compositions.
Perfect. So now you've got a whole list of artists to explore, and if you're ever feeling lost in a museum or gallery, just remember what we've talked about today. Look for those signs of mannerism, elongated figures, complex compositions, the mix of beauty and unease, and those bold colors. And don't be afraid to embrace the weirdness.
Because sometimes the most interesting art is the art that challenges us.
That's a great point. Thanks for joining us for this mannerism deep dive.
My pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those aha moments coming. Welcome back. We've gone through all the history and ideas behind mannerism, and now I'm ready to see it in action. I want to see those masterpieces.
All right, well, let's start with Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck. We talked about it earlier, remember? It's a really good example of how mannerists did religious art, but in their own way.
Yeah, the one where Mary's neck is super long, right?
Yeah. Parmigianino, he wasn't afraid to change things up a bit. Mary's long neck and baby Jesus looking a bit big for his body. It creates this strange effect. It's beautiful, but it's also kind of unsettling. He's playing with what we expect a Madonna to look like.
It definitely makes you do a double take. It's not your typical peaceful Renaissance Madonna.
Right. So besides the obvious, like those stretched out figures, what else should we be looking at in this painting?
Good question.
Look at the light and shadow. The figures have this soft glow around them, but the background is really dark. It makes it dramatic and mysterious. You get pulled into this weird world.
Yeah, it's like a dream or a vision.
Yeah.
Beautiful, but maybe a little bit creepy at the same time.
Exactly. And that mix of beauty and unease, that's classic mannerism.
Okay, let's move on to another artist who was great at creating drama, Pontormo. Have you heard of his deposition from the cross? Yeah. It's the one where everyone's like swirling around, right?
Yeah.
I saw it in a book once, and it was so striking.
It's definitely memorable. Pontormo throws out the rule book on how to show the deposition. The figures are twisted, their poses are almost impossible. It's chaotic and full of emotion. You can see the grief and confusion and everything else going on.
Yeah, he's showing us the emotional aftermath of this huge event. And the colors, too, they're so vibrant and they kind of clash. It adds to the drama.
You're right. Pontormo was a master of color. He used those bold colors, sometimes colors that you wouldn't expect together to create a certain mood to get a reaction from the viewer.
Okay, so we've got drama, we've got emotion, we've got lots of color.
Hmm.
What else is there to look for when we're thinking about mannerism?
Oh, we can't forget about Bronzino and his portraits. They're really elegant, but also strangely cold and detached.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. I saw one of his portraits once. It was this woman in these amazing clothes, but her face was just blank. Like a beautiful doll, but with no personality.
Exactly. That's what Bronzino was doing. He was showing this artificiality, this emotional distance that was common in court life back then. It's like he's saying, look at all this wealth and beauty, but there's no real connection.
Yeah, it's like a commentary on how superficial everything was.
Yeah, and that connects to the deeper meaning in a lot of Mannerist art. It's not just about what you see, it's about the bigger social and psychological stuff that's going on.
So we shouldn't just look at a Mannerist painting and say, oh, that's pretty. We should try to figure out what the artist is trying to tell us about the world, about what it means to be human.
Exactly. And that's why Mannerism is still so relevant today. It speaks to all the complicated parts of being human, especially in a world that's always changing and never quite makes sense.
And that brings us back to the question we talked about earlier. If Mannerism was a reaction to a world that was changing so much, what does the art of today say about our world?
That's a great question to think about as you keep looking at art. Whether it's Mannerism or modern art, look for those clues, those visual and emotional things that tell you about the artist's world, their hopes, their fears, their unique perspective.
I love that. So everyone listening, the next time you're in a museum or looking at art online, remember to keep an eye out for those Mannerism things. The long figures, the complex compositions, that mix of beauty and strangeness, and the bold colors.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid of the weird stuff.
Those unexpected moments, the art that challenges you, that's where you often find the most interesting ideas and the most rewarding experiences.
So true. Well, I think that wraps up our Mannerism deep dive.
It does, and it's been a great one.
I've learned so much. It's not just weird Renaissance art. It's so much more than that. It reflects a world that was dealing with change and uncertainty just like ours.
Yeah, it reminds us that art is always more than just something that looks nice. It reflects who we are, where we come from, and where we're going.
Couldn't have said better myself.
Yeah.
Thank you for exploring the world of Mannerism with us.
It was my pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep having those aha moments.